What's up, Tristan Talks family? Welcome back to another video. These videos are going to be posted throughout the week on YouTube and Instagram, so tap in with those. Today we're going to be talking about Kwame Ture and his speech on Zionism and white supremacy. So this is from the University of Minnesota speech back in 1990, where he says Zionism is racism according to the United Nations. But he says, I won't even hide behind the United Nations. I know it's racism. So we're going to get into a deep dive on some of the political education on Zionism and white supremacy, because there's often some misuse of the word Zionism and comparing it to Jewish people, when in reality that is not true. There's a difference between Zionism and Jewish people as a whole. And here we're talking about that. And I know you're wondering, why do you talk so much about Jewish people? Stop asking me questions. I'm trolling. But I talk so much about Jewish people as much as I talk so much about black people and oppressed people, because no one is truly free until all oppressed people are free. And so if we can only focus on one set of oppressed people, how are we going to change the dynamic of it? How are we going to abolish oppression if we only focus on black oppression? They are all important, but if we just sit here and focus on one oppression and call it that all oppression are linear, and it's more, you are getting oppressed for more, and you're getting your head scalped off, and you're getting your rights taken away. It's all the same oppression. No matter what type of oppression it is, it's all the same oppression. We all, so I'm gonna get a little open, and it says we're gonna talk about what happens when a black man, such as Kwame Ture, he was a revolutionary. He wrote the blueprint for black power in America. But when he stands up and says Zionism and white supremacy are the same system, he gets called anti-Semitic. He gets isolated, and the organization he built gets dismantled in 3 months. But they couldn't stop the argument. You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. Decades later, we're still having conversations about Zionism, and so we're gonna go all the way in. We're talking about Kwame Ture's framework on Zionism, Imperialism, and white supremacy, and we're just letting the man speak for himself, because these conversations are needed to be had. And when we call it something different, we forget the idea of what it actually means. So just stay with me. This is deep. Y'all gonna sit with me, and I got y'all. But who was Kwame Ture? You need to understand who this man was, because you can't separate his ideas from his life. He wasn't a man sitting in an ivory tower. He was someone who was actually putting his body on the line. His birth name was Stokely Carmichael. He was born in Trinidad in 1941, moved to New York, and became one of the most important figures in the American Civil Rights Movement. He organized in the Deep South with the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was on the Freedom Rides. He was in Mississippi during the Freedom Summer. He was in Loudoun County, Alabama, when black people were being murdered for trying to vote. But here's where the story shifts. By 1966, Carmichael gave us two words that changed the entire conversation: Black Power. That phrase cracked the civil rights movement right down the middle. The integrationists went one way, the revolutionaries went the other, and Carmichael went towards revolution. He moved to Guinea in West Africa in 1969 and changed his name to Kwame Ture, honoring Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Sekou Touré of Guinea. I think I messed that up. But he dedicated his life to Pan-African socialism. When he died in 1998 at 57 years old from prostate cancer, and until his last days, he was still giving speeches and still organizing and still studying. I hope that's my life. But I hope I don't die from prostate cancer. But that's the idea I want my life. I want to be giving speeches. I want to organize. I want to study until the day I die. But Ture said he began studying Zionism seriously in 1965 after a fellow SNCC member who has worked in South America brought the subject to him. For over 30 years, he read at least one book per month on the topic and attended anti-Zionist international symposiums in Baghdad and Tripolia. This was not a casual opinion, it was a lifetime study. So why does this all matter, right? It matters because when Kwame Ture spoke on Zionism, he wasn't shooting from the hip. This was a man who spent literally decades researching, reading, attending international forums. He was connecting the dots between American liberation movement, the Palestinian struggle, and global imperialism. And he saw them all the same fight. So we're going to just start where he started, with a basic distinction that a lot of people still don't make today. That, as I said before, Judaism is not Zionism. This is the first thing Kwame Ture actually establishes. Every single time he spoke on Zionism, he always said that Judaism is not Zionism. There was a line between Judaism as a religion and Zionism as a political ideology. He was very absolute on this. He was firm, because if you blur that line, nothing else makes sense. And he said in 1990 speech at the University of Minnesota, the religion of Judaism and the political philosophy of Zionism must be completely separated. Judaism is a religion, and as an African, I am very proud of this religion because it was given to the world by my people. Judaism began in Africa. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it makes sense, but I don't know how true that is. But here, Judaism began in Africa, he says. But Ture didn't just say that, he backed it up. He pointed out to Sigmund Freud's final book, Moses and Monotheism. When Freud, I don't know these people. No, I'm joking. I do know these people. But he used the historical and psychoanalytical evidence to argue that Moses himself was African, and that monotheism, the belief in one God, originated in Africa before spreading outward. Ture's arguments was that Africa gave monotheism to the world. It was an African spiritual soil that made Judaism possible. So when people calls him anti-Semitic for opposing Zionism, he says that, how can I, as an African, be against the spiritual legacy of my ancestors? Now, it gets interesting historically here, because Zionism as a formal political ideology or movement didn't exist until 1897. And that's when Theodor Herzl convened the first World Zionist Congress in Switzerland. And Ture pointed out something crucial about that meeting. It had been held in Switzerland because the majority of Orthodox Jewish communities in Europe were against Zionism. They didn't want it. They rejected it on the religious grounds. So out the gate, Zionism was not speaking for all Jewish people. It was a specific political faction, rejected by many of the most devout Jewish communities at its founding. Herzl was a founder of modern Zionism, and he was an atheist, and he stated that God does not exist in his diaries, and it's very contradictory that an atheist would base the political movement on a divine promise of land, arguing the entire religious justification for the Zionist state was therefore built on an intellectual fraud. Do you see what I'm saying? But Ture loved this point. Herzl was an atheist. The man founded on Zionism didn't believe in God. He was using the concept of the divine promised land as a political tool, while privately rejecting the divine entirely. How does an atheist go looking for a land that God promised his chosen people? That's not theology, that's politics wrapped in religion. So Zionism as a project of imperialism. Now, this is where Ture is drawing on Lenin, on Nkrumah, on a whole tradition of anti-colonial thought. His argument is this: Zionism is not a liberation movement, it's the opposite. It's a colonial movement that attached itself to the dominant imperial power of its era, which is Britain, in order to establish a settler state of land that had already belonged to someone else. So the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which is British Foreign Secretary author James Balfour, wrote a letter stating that British viewed with the favor of establishment of a national home for Jewish people in Palestine. Now think about that for a second. Think about it. Palestine didn't belong to Britain. Britain was colonizing it. And Balfour is promising someone else's land to a third party. This is what that Ture says, that Palestine didn't belong to the British, just like Ireland doesn't belong to the British. Here these British imperialists signed a note and gave it to the Jews, and they accepted it. Where's the morality in this? Once you go an immoral being such as British imperialism as the basis for getting land, then clearly those who are liberation fighters must question this. If you are truly fighting for your people's liberation, you don't go to the world's leading colonial power and ask them for a land grant. That's not liberation, that's collaboration with the system you claim to be fighting against. Real liberations movements like the ANC in South Africa, the FLN in Algeria, the ZANU in Zimbabwe, the PIGC in Guinea, all of these movements fought British and European imperialism. They didn't form alliances with it to get territory. And so Ture expanded this to America. By the 1990s, Israel had become the single largest recipient in U.S. foreign aid in the world. He pointed out if America imperialism, which he called the leading imperialist force on the planet, has to fund you to stay alive, you are not a liberation movement, you are an extension of empire. This is why people say Israel controls America. No, America controls Israel. Because you are not a liberation movement, you are an extension of an empire for America to get so America can get presence in the Middle East. But in the 1980s, Ture found that the worldwide African Anti-Zionist Front, arguing that Zionist was a direct enemy of Africa and not just a Palestinian problem. He pointed out to Israeli cooperation with apartheid South Africa, Israeli military strikes on African nations, and the use of Israel as a beachhead for U.S. and European imperialism on the African continent. He framed anti-Zionism as inseparable from Pan-African liberation. So, because some people may ask, why did Ture care so much about this? Because he's a Pan-Africanist. Why is he spending so much energy on Palestine? Zionism is an African problem. He pointed to the Israeli military relationship with apartheid South Africa. He pointed to the Israeli airstrikes on Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Uganda, all African nations. He said, I'm paraphrasing, when you shoot down a Libyan civilian airplane, you are shooting down an African airplane. When you invade Uganda, you invade Africa. Zionism in his framework was operating as a forward operating base for Western imperialism, positioned at the tip of the African continent. But why did Ture call it white supremacy? Ture says that Zionism and white supremacy are the same system. This is a structural argument. It's not a loose comparison. White supremacy at its core is not just about skin color. It's an ideology that justifies in the dispossession of non-European peoples from their land, their resources, and their future, usually through a combination of violence, legal frameworks, and cultural propaganda. That's what white supremacy does as a system, regardless of who's running it. Now, Ture describes Zionism in practice. So Zionism, he said, came and took a people's land through what he called raw and naked terrorism. He pointed to figures like Benin, who led the Irgun, I think that's how you say it, IRGUN, a paramilitary organization that conducted attacks on Palestinian villages to terrorize the population into fleeing. He later became the Prime Minister of Israel and won a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not oppressed, and then Ture wasn't impressed. But Ture says that the principles of Zionism are unjust. The question whether or not Zionism is white supremacy is not the question. I need not the answer to the question. The United Nations gave the answers years ago. They said Zionism is racism. I know it's racism. Anytime you will come and take a people's land, Zionism does the same thing that imperialism did with Christianity. He's referencing the UN Resolution 3379 from 1795, which declared Zionism as a form of racial discrimination. Now, that resolution was eventually revoked in 1991 under heavy U.S. and Israeli pressure. But the point is that the fact that it passed at all, giving enormous lobbying power Israel had in international bodies, told you everything you needed to know. It took a serious, determined global coalition to get that vote through. It was a real resolution. But the deeper argument is about the parallels in structure. When European settlers colonized the Americas, they came in with a Bible and the gun. They said God gave them this land. They called the people already there savages. They used religious and cultural justification to do what was exactly a land grab enforced through violence. Ture said Zionism followed the exact same playbook. They used religion as a cover for land seizure. They used military force to make it stick. Then lean on a dominant imperial power of the day for protection. Y'all understand what I'm saying? But American imperialism and Zionist lobby were so thoroughly controlled by information environment that people only heard one side, the Israeli side. He said back in 1967, the SNCC simply put out a statement saying there are two sides to this conflict and we should hear both. They were destroyed. And this part is really important. He says the SNCC took a strong position against the war in Vietnam. We spoke against the drafts. Zionists supported it. But once we spoke against Israel, SNCC was destroyed in 3 months. These are the facts. But think about what he's saying here. SNCC could challenge the U.S. military, the draft, the war in Vietnam, and keep its funding, keep its support. The moment it challenged Israel, it was gone in 3 months. That for Ture was evidence of the death of Zionism integration into the American power structure. But was Kwame Ture actually anti-Semitic? Because this is one of the most common responses to this speech. Every time he gets to the speech, someone stands up and calls him anti-Semitic. Ture's response to anti-Semitic charge was consistent. He made 3 points. The first point was anti-Semitism technically refers to the prejudice against Semitic people. Palestinians are Semitic. Yasser Arafat was Semitic. Ture's support for the Palestinian cause meant he was, if anything, defending Semitic people, not attacking them. Second, he was proud of Judaism as a religion. He credited Africa as its birthplace. He said he would never say anything against Judaism as a faith tradition. He insisted there were many anti-Zionist Jews, including Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn, who argue, and he quotes, and I quote as well, a Zionist can never be a Jew, and a Jew can never be a Zionist. He repeatedly emphasized that the confusion between Judaism and Zionism was not an accident, it was a deliberate strategy. By making them appear identical, any criticism of the Israel state or Zionist ideology could be deflected as an attack on Jewish people and Jewish religion. He called the Zionist tactic not a genuine argument. But not everything Kwame Ture said went without legitimate criticisms. His comments, such as the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist, was inflammatory, and by the end of his own framing, intended as political rhetoric, comparing Zionists to Nazis. Some critics who agreed with his core anti-Zionist argument also argued that this language crossed from political critique into dehumanization. His remarks about Jews being supposed to accept suffering were also widely criticized as insensitive to Jewish trauma and difficult to separate from religious stereotyping. A fair engagement with Ture's work means acknowledging both the power of his structural analysis and the places where his rhetoric became counterproductive. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Kwame Ture was perfect. He said some things that were needlessly inflammatory. The only good Zionist is a dead Zionist is a line got a lot of attention while he framed it as a political statement, comparing Zionists to Nazis. You can argue that kind of rhetoric makes your actual analysis harder to hear, and it did, of course, and it gave people who wanted to dismiss the argument an easy way out. But if you throw out the entire analysis because of this inflammatory rhetoric, you're doing exactly what the propaganda intended. You're letting packaging erase the content. Ture's structural argument about Zionism as a colonial project aligned with imperialism. It stands or falls on its own merits. You should argue with that instead. But here's why it matters now. We're talking about a speech from 1990 because this framework Kwame Ture laid out is still the sharpest tool in the box for understanding what's happening in the world today. He connected colonialism in Africa, settler colonialism in Palestine, and American imperial foreign policy into a single analysis, and he showed how these systems protect and reproduce each other. He also showed what the cost of speaking clearly looks like. SNCC was dismantled. He was called anti-Semitic everywhere he went. He spent the rest of his life in Africa because he knew he couldn't do his work safely in America. That's not small. That's a man who paid a serious price for saying what he believed was true. The question Ture left us with is the question he built his entire life on. Whose liberation are you actually committed to? Because in this framework, if you claim to be against white supremacy and imperialism in America, but stay silent on Palestine or stay silent on Africa, then you're not really against the system. You're just against the parts of it that affect you personally. And that's the challenge that Kwame Ture wants you to pick up. But I'm going to put my references in the chat and down below. Stay critical. Keep thinking. This has been Tristan Talks. Peace.